Welcome to the Compass Conversations podcast. We're a community of professional peers who love learning with and from each other. In other words, we choose collaboration over competition. Every conversation here is organic. Even the opening topic isn't settled until 5 minutes before we hit record. And the rest is riffing off of each other's brilliance. Thanks for hanging out with us in a new paradigm of learning, teaching, and expansion, where presence and non-competitive conversation create the space to learn without having to be schooled. Please visit compassconversations.com to discover more about this peer community and to include yourself as a sponsor. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our next Compass Conversations. I'm Carrie Lake, and here today with Jessica Whiteplume, Christine Dixon, Jane Pike, and Sarah Schlote. And I'll just start with our invocation to launch our conversation today. These conversations are shared from our sense of connection, camaraderie, and love. This community of peers is curious to learn from and with one another, living, learning, leading by example. We're exploring together, acknowledging the interspecies family on this planet while lovingly including ourselves in the family of life from the heart for the heart. So I'm just so grateful and excited to be here with all of you guys today. And as always, we chose a starting point for our conversation about 3 minutes before we hit record here today. And the direction we wanted to play, and Sarah, you can fill us in a little bit more on where this was coming from in your heart, but it's in the direction of how do we recognize the synchronicities in our world? How do we recognize being aligned? Like, what do synchronicities mean? How do we hear them? How do we listen to them? Whether it's in the context of our own life or in relationships with others, because it can be really easy to overthink it and try to get it right, right? And so, Sarah, do you want to jump in a little bit and share a little bit more from your heart where this curiosity was from and where we can go in our conversation?
Yeah, certainly. So I find that as someone who's always been, I'm a weird mix of like science and spirituality. So I'm an odd mutt that way. And one of the things that I've always had a deep connection to is, I don't know how you'd call it, like metaphysical something or other. I've always had some sort of connection to something that's greater than just sort of the current default settings that we're on. And signs have always been something that's shown up for me, and usually it's been through animal messages or other weird alignments, like thinking about something and then suddenly it shows up, or I haven't heard about this thing and suddenly I heard about this thing 3 times in the last 4 hours, and it was like I've never heard of this in 30 years, and suddenly 4 people have mentioned this one thing, and so I've always had a real sense of awareness of like these little things that can show up along the way like that. And they've always been really powerful guideposts, and like dreams, those kinds of things. And I was just sort of really curious recently about some changes in my own world where I had noticed that there was less of that. And I was trying to sort of grapple with why that was the case. And being told recently by a dear colleague of mine, oh, well, it's probably because you're actually out of a lot of stuff that you used to be in, and you followed those things into where you're supposed to be. And so, you're not being sent as many synchronicities and signposts at the moment because you are where you're finally supposed to be right now. And I was like, well, that's a nice way of looking at it. But I still get really curious about, is there something I'm missing, because there's always this perpetual engagement with the divine or universe or whatever, and trying to find other ways of connecting with that. And not that there haven't been, there's been a few resuming recently. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, where has that been all this time, and feeling a little bit mystified, but also really curious. about like, oh, those were gone for so long. And suddenly all these little synchronicities have been lining up again. Does that mean I'm back in alignment or that I'm moving out of alignment? So it's like just a neat thing, I think, to get curious about is, noticing them for me has never been the issue, but it's always like, oh, when do they go away? And when do they return, and making sense of that? And what happens if we just stop trying to make sense of it and just follow, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love what you just said. It's so common, like we're taught to think in this analytical way of what does it
Mm-hmm.
mean, and then what do I
Yeah,
do so that I can
yeah,
get it right? And
totally.
to me, I wonder if that's even an appropriate uh, perspective from which to receive the signs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure we all have some stories of our own experiences, and please, anybody jump in at any time if this is sparking a story of yours. Um, but I know, Sarah, like I think everybody who might be listening to these conversations has these experiences as well. So thank you for bringing it forward. It's an amazing
Mhm.
thing to
Yeah,
explore.
yeah.
Yeah. Jess, do you want to jump in a little bit? Because I know you have these experiences as well, and I'm really curious how you relate when you see a communication or a sign.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. First of all, I just have to gush and say I'm so happy to be on each and every one of you. I feel like any one of you, we could hang out for days and just have the best time. And I know we haven't spent that much time together, but I consider you all really good friends, and I'm just so happy that we're able to like carve out these little bits of time anyway and hang out, even if it's virtually. So thank you all so much. And I'm glad Sarah has brought this up because it's kind of woo in some ways out there, but really it's like that's probably the larger, bigger picture, um, you know, place that we want to stay connected to all the time. So when we all have busy lives, so it's good to take a moment to talk about it, take a beat, as they say, and think about what kind of signs are happening or not happening, and yeah, I think that's kind of what you mentioned is where I catch myself now too, is if I catch myself trying to figure that out or ever feeling like I'm doing it wrong, then there's a little nudge that says, okay, there's no doing it wrong. And that's not really that's somehow artificially created. The truth of it is that it's all love. It's all on the path. And that's, in a sense, it's generic, but like an example that came up, I was working with another young woman who was very near postpartum. She had just had a baby 3 weeks ago, and she was actually part of this treatment process, an intensive treatment process. And so she had all these like sessions all day and, expectations and routines and whatnot. And she was, much like a lot of working moms, was trying to just do the best job that she could. And I was trying to explain to her, um, and which is at the same time trying to remind myself all the time, every day, that even like the roughest, most seemingly ugly, difficult parts, even when you're postpartum and like in pain and mad at people and like leaking, like that is a sacred time. It's supposed to be difficult is part of it, and that there's a sacredness there. And I almost feel cliche saying it, like I can't articulate it, but I believe that to be true, if that makes sense.
I on that, I was thinking when we were talking about this earlier that I almost think that when the signs stop or you feel like you're not in the flow state anymore, that uncomfortableness of not knowing and feeling uncomfortable could be intentional, because it makes us then reach out and step outside of what we maybe we're only focused on, and look outside that bubble and look for more information and guides. Whereas if we were in that warm, fuzzy state, we wouldn't be looking for that, right? So sometimes that can be pressure, that uncomfortableness of going, I'm not seeing the signs. But now, maybe because there's work that we need to do before we get that next one, and we kind of got to swim in that for a while, that plateau space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There were a number of years where horses were not in my life, like, at all. And I only knew myself in the context of horses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if I was far away from them, at least I had a way to access them, or I had an identity built around, Carrie works with horses. And
Mm-hmm.
there were many times where it seemed like the horses just sort of left my life, and I was left in this place of confusion, thinking and wondering, what have I done wrong? How come nothing's happening? What have I done wrong? And it felt like being kicked out of the nest over and over, like I was being told by the horses, nah, well, maybe you blew it and you don't deserve to be around us anymore. That's how it was being interpreted. And so I kept trying to make something happen. I would go here, I would talk to that person, and it seemed like everything every time just crumbled out from under me. Even when if something showed up unexpectedly, a phone call or an opportunity, and I would get excited again, like, back on track, here we go. And then 2 conversations in, it would all crumble and fall out from under me again. And so I was constantly stressed and trying to look at, what have I done wrong? What do I have to do differently? And it basically sort of burned all my energy out, and I was exhausted trying to figure out what to do and what to do correctly. At some point, logically, I kind of reasoned that I had to ask a different question, like a couple different questions. Who am I then? Who am I if I'm not Carrie who works with horses, right? Who am I if I'm not Carrie who teaches things? Who am I really? And then the other question was probably scarier than that. The second question I had to start asking is, what is it I think I want? Because I kept thinking I wanted to be with horses, right? That's the way. And it kept not happening. And I don't even know what inspired me to ask that question and ask it differently, but I started asking, what is it that I get from horses? What do I think I need from them? And what do I think I want from them? Because then that opened up an opportunity for me to look even a level broader or deeper or both, which was, what are my real priorities, right? If being with horses satisfies something for me, what is it that it satisfies, and what are the priorities? So I had to start asking questions from a bigger place, rather than trying to figure out what I was doing right or wrong to have connections or see the signs or be guided. Like when it seems like guidance just goes, silent. What I learned to do, especially around horses, is come back to my heart and ask a bigger, excuse me, a bigger question of, what are my real priorities, whether horses satisfy that or not? And once I created that space and started asking a bigger question, that was when I became available to see a new level of synchronicities, a new level of connections, rather than trying to understand and satisfy my current or familiar level of understanding. And it meant that I didn't know what I was doing. I had to make it up as I go. But I got much more clear on what my actual priorities are, whether it involved horses or not. And it opened doors I didn't even know existed, you know?
Mhm.
I'm loving what you're all saying, because there's bits and pieces in all of that that kind of fit. And you had said something about the birth process, Jessica, about this woman who was going through that. And I know for me, one of the things that I've been kind of dealing with recently is I feel like I'm birthing multiple babies at once. And I'm at a point in the birthing process where I'm just kind of tired and I want to give up and not keep birthing these things. And in spite of my best attempts at staggering these births, they all have coalesced into the same time frame. And so there's a little bit of that I'm like, oh, so is it that, like you said, Carrie, is it that I'm doing something wrong? Or is it the wrong question? Like, I also look at the bigger meta picture of this, of going, oh, well, actually there's too many births happening at once and I'm just birth exhausted, and running out of fumes, or running on fumes rather. But that question of, oh, where am I? Like, is there a teaching in this for me? And I've asked that question so many times. And I found that sometimes is the wrong question, because I go, because I've done what I can. I've asked so many people, I've sought guidance, I keep doing my work, and I keep getting thrown roadblocks and no more signs. And I go, okay, so that's the wrong question for me, because I'm just agonizing over what have I not done yet? What is the meaning in this, or what is the teaching? And I think sometimes social media kind of leads us in that direction too, because we see that a lot in memes that get shared, right? It's like, oh, like there's like pop culture, new agey stuff that gets shared. And I think it's well intentioned, but I think sometimes it can be quite harmful. Like, oh, well, if you're having all these difficulties or this thing has changed in your life, there's something in this for you. There's a teaching in this for you that you just haven't figured out yet. And until you figure that thing out, it's going to keep happening. And I find that can be really destructive and really toxic sometimes, because gosh, sometimes these processes are way bigger and we don't always see them until many years have gone by. And sometimes we don't know until the veil is dropped and we've passed on. I think that we're not going to get the message or whatever that was about, until much later. And does that mean that we did something wrong? Did that mean that we didn't listen to the call? And I don't know that it's always so much like that,
Right.
Yeah.
That for some reason that sparks in me a thing. So I hope it's valuable to share, but it's just something that very, very rarely comes up, because we're all on the path, right? Meaning we're going somewhere all the time. We're healing, we're building, we're growing, we're learning, and it's all wonderful. And for some reason, what came up, and again, it's not common, because I try to be an achiever, quote unquote. We all are, in the best of ways. Anyway, what come up is that, what if I just didn't do anything? Like, what if you just stopped all your births, stopped all your calls, dropped all your clients, didn't feed the horses, like just tell somebody else to feed them, like what would happen? Or would you be okay? And I mean, I'm saying that to me, all of us, any of us, hypothetically, to myself, because it's like I get attached to the concept of something is supposed to be all the time. And does that mean I would be bad? Does that mean I would be less worthwhile if I just didn't do, like, my list is lengthy, I'm sure all of ours are. If I just didn't do none of those, are we still worthwhile? Like, would my horse say I'm still worthwhile?
Yeah. Yeah. And thankfully, I find that that's not a driver for me, but I could imagine there's going to be people for whom that is absolutely a driver. It's like, oh, like, why am I doing all these things and what's happening, and what's behind that, for sure. Definitely. And the delegation of tasks is really essential. That's something that, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, I get really just interested in these bigger patterns. And what is there in this for me? And sometimes even that question, though, like somebody said, a while ago that I really appreciated, which was, I think it was you, Carrie, and you'd said something about asking a different kind of question. And I think, Jessica, that's kind of what you just did there. Is like, oh, there's a different question in that. And one of the ones for me was recently the signs that I'm normally used to seeing are the ones that I'm not seeing now, but that it doesn't mean that there haven't been. And so what has been changing in me recently is going, oh, but what has been showing up? And I think there's been a grieving of the previous kinds of signs that I used to get. And when I grieve those signs, because those seem to have, I followed all of those up to a certain point, and then I felt like I was left hung and dried without any further signs going, what happened? But there's different whispers showing up and different messages showing up. And when I orient to that, it's like, oh, there are still signs. They're just different from the ones I was used to getting. But there's a sadness there too, I think, because I miss those other ones. And those ones were really, really important. And those ones haven't happened in a long time. But it's not that they haven't. And so sometimes the signs or the messages change their form, or if you change levels of development in your own growth, the chapter that you came through and the signs that you used to seeing here, if you're in a new phase of growth, it's going to look different. And so it's a sign of having transitioned into a new chapter. And then what are the messages and signs here? And I think part of what for me recently that I'm realizing was, oh, I've been in this sort of transitional phase from one chapter or phase into a new one. And I'm still looking for the old signs as I'm in this new chapter. Right. And so that's why I like when you said, what's the question? So it's not, oh, where did you go? It's like, oh, how are you manifesting now? And maybe that's the question, right?
Well, to me, like I get all excited listening to what you're saying, because another question presents for me in the awareness you just drew out, where we graduate a certain realm of consciousness, a certain way of being. And the next question for me is, okay, then who am I now?
Yeah.
Like,
which is Jessica's question, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Where you're saying, what are the signs? That's a sort of a linear approach that says, okay, I recognize I'm in a new place now. Bing, 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 looking for little anchor points. To me, there's a broader feeling when I ask, okay, I can see something has changed here. Show me now, who am I in this realm of consciousness? Bring me what works for me here, which is different than trying to use to find a familiarity of something to prove to me blah 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 blah. But the conversation makes me really curious. Jane, we haven't heard from you yet, and I wonder if you've ever experienced any overwhelm or change in your life.
No, that's very unfamiliar to me, Carrie.
Really? That surprises me, Jane. I mean,
I'll just compose myself at that thought. I've been so enjoying listening to you all. I've got lots of little notes in front of me, and it just feels such a privilege to be a part of the conversation. So thank you for having me here. My first thought was there is a difference between looking for signs and being presented with signs. And I think that is in part what you have just been talking about, Sarah, in that when we have been presented with signs that manifest in a particular way, that starts to orient our vision towards seeking them out in that same way. And when they start to be presented differently and we've developed an expectation about how they arrive, it's not that the signs aren't there. It's just that now the way that we're facing the conversation needs to change. So for me, that's very much a part of it. And it also ties in, and this isn't specific, what I'm saying at all isn't specific to you, Sarah, it's just sort of specific to the conversation, is that we have somewhat of an obsession in our culture, I believe, with emotional progress, with like needing to keep on moving forward and like get to the next thing. And where I attempt to rest with varying degrees of success, depending on the day, is within a place of having a sense of a bigger picture, whilst also apprenticing myself to the present moment and what's going on. And so what I become really interested in is, if something is visiting with me for a certain period of time, how is it that I can be with this? How is it that I can metabolize this? And that process may take far longer than ideally I would like it to, especially if it's uncomfortable, and especially if it involves sorrow or upset or change, and is a shedding of skin. And so what I recognize and what I see happen a lot in my work is that people feel like alignment will always feel comfortable. And I think alignment can feel excruciating if it involves the undoing of patterns in your experience, where perhaps you have to disappoint someone or leave someone behind or change something which is being current in your experience. That is a painful alignment. But it's still alignment, you know, and so that the signs that come out in that place can be much more subtle, because the work is actually to stay. Like, you are supposed to be here in this right now. The work is to stay. And perhaps the absence of signs in the way that we would understand them to be typically showing up is the sign. You know, like the absence of sign is the sign. And it's just, it becomes a way that we're facing the conversation, or the way we're facing the conversation is the most important thing. And it's kind of, you're always traversing one of those edges. It's kind of like the same edge of grief, really, which is like, this is the time where you really sense your own aliveness the most, you know, when you're going through these like hotbeds of experience. And what I think is missing that makes it so challenging, and I've been considering this a lot recently as well, is there is a huge emphasis on healing and, you know, moving forward. And you use the word roadblock, Sarah, which I find really interesting. It's like, is it a roadblock, or is it just the next point? Like, what is it that is coming up? But again, I've got a little bit off track from what I was going to say, surprisingly, which is, you know, we feel, and there is a huge onus on individual responsibility for reconciliation of what it is that's going on in our experience. And what we're missing, I believe, is collective responsibility for each other. We're missing the ritual. We're missing the container that would hold us collectively and individually as we go through this experience, so that you, Sarah, or me, Jane, or you know, Christine, or Jessica, or Kerry, if we were in the fire of this change experience, or this moment where it's like, I can't see the signs, this is hard, like we would go, you're okay, like you're good, like we've got you. And there would be someone as part of a wider community originally that would be helping us take care of the psychic energy of that, of the emotional energy of that, of the healing part of that, which is now left to the individual. And so I'm really interested at the moment in thinking, like, how do we better support ourselves, each other as a collective in those moments? And what is what is my responsibility to you, Sarah, when I hear you say that, or, you know, when someone else says that, what is my responsibility? Because we all benefit and thrive when we're supporting each other. So does that relate to, I hope it relates. It was what kind of came up for me as part of this.
I'm really hearing, sorry, who was?
Go ahead. I was just going to say it relates beautifully, but please go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. I feel that sense of collectivity around me. I've got like a good circle of people, you know, that I've been able to turn to. We kind of mutually hold that space for each other. And so there's that individual sort of level, and then there's like the meta level, or the collective level you're talking about, Jane, that I think is really essential. And I feel grateful that I've got my little circle, and I realize some people don't even have that. You know, they've got these people who can hold that space for each other. And I have that part of it. But this collective piece, and I'm really just sitting with the collective grief of the losses that have come from colonization that have impeded and have removed access to that and ritual and collective holding. And Jessica, you can probably speak to that a little bit as well, but I'm recognizing that there are absolutely cultures and communities where that ritual holding of self being spirit through transitional times into as things coalesce, as there are these liminal phases in people's lives, that there are communities and cultures and traditions and rituals for this. And there's also a loss of that as a result of colonization. So I just wanted to kind of speak to the rupture there. I think psychically, like we're talking about this energetic piece, there's been breaking of that. And so I'm just sitting with the, wow, there's this beautiful solution and this thing that we're lacking, and we're lacking it because of,
Yeah.
so yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, we do, not to be the one, the one representative of indigenous, cultures and ceremonies, but we do, we do have that. I mean, at different stages in my life, and it's interesting how you phrase it, Jane, is really helpful, that it's almost like it's a backdrop or a catching net or something that I feel like is always there. Like I'm on my individual journey, but I also know if I felt like I needed a ceremony for something in particular, or when I did get to a certain stage where I felt like I was really transitioning into adulthood, which wasn't into my 40s. Fun fact. But that was waiting.
We should all put our little hands up.
And and that web of cultural family pulled together, and everybody knew the pieces, and this is what we do, and it's beautiful, and sisters have done it at different times, and this is what we do. So I feel, I guess, pretty privileged to be able to have that, and it's certainly I mean, we don't live the way that we did a long time ago in that space more so all the time, but now I feel like if there's a particular tailspin, I know that I have this annual kind of retreat, which is our ceremony coming up, and that's really going to help me. Not that it's just that magical thing in that moment, but that there is a magic, and I might not feel connected to it at the moment, but there's no doubt that it is always there. And so anyway, but as you're saying, Sarah, not to, it's not about me or our ceremonies, but if a community doesn't have that, how can we move back to that? Because we all did at one point.
Yeah.
And are there different forms? Do we want to create our own? And even among indigenous tribes, a lot of them have been lost. Where I live here with my husband, the Mandan people, those are almost entirely lost. So the ceremonies they do practice are largely Sioux ceremonies. And some people are slowly, for example, in the songs, some people are recreating songs through prayer and just believing that our ancestors would be okay with this imperfect version, because that's all we have. The rest was destroyed by, the military and smallpox. So this is what we have. And around the world, people are trying to recreate that, I believe. And I believe really what we're doing now is part of that, right? I mean, to jump on in this group of people that come together through this healing symposium, thing, to jump on and be like, my week went to heck.
Yeah.
Let's all talk about it. That's different, right? That might have not happened before. And I wouldn't call it a ritual per se, but I just love that we're talking about it. I love it. I love all of you. And again, I don't think there's a wrong way to go about this.
I think as well, though, when you speak to that, like, sorry, I'm just got excitable now. And, we're, as part of our core makeup, at the start, we sort of were like, is this a woo conversation? Is this, that, or the other? But actually, like, this is our conversation. This is like, we aren't designed for shallow conversation, and we reject it, I think, on some level. And that's why we feel so much an absence of connection, is because it's not normalized anymore to actually, like, really share something intimate about ourselves with each other on the daily, you know, and to be also connected to this sense of like wonderment and beauty and awe that is, again, I believe part of our collective nature, instead of like hardship and survival and like kind of trying to get through the day. Like that's actually what creates this absence. And to my mind and in my experience, and perhaps this is a little bit of what you were speaking to as well, Sarah, we are perhaps absent from or separated from, in some cultures, a collective container that is able to speak to and facilitate and guide us through the experiences that we're having, and yet we're still having the experiences in that, like, I recognize that my body is born with the many stories of the people that came before me, which exists alongside my own story, which exists if I go into the landscape. Like there's a beautiful bush track I ride up, and yesterday they'd felled like a whole area of trees, and I felt grief. Like it was an actual like oof, like in my stomach, like I felt the energy of the area had changed. And that shouldn't be a weird thing to vocalize, you know, like that shouldn't be, but in some circles people are like, oh, well, that is. And so we're sitting with this dichotomy, I think, of like, this is a real experience in my body, and how is it kind of held and nurtured. That just is what came up for me in that part there.
I just wanted to add that, you know, one of the headlines yesterday was that the U.S. Surgeon General said that there is an epidemic of loneliness in this country. And, you know, I don't think that there's that idea that this country was based on, in the sense of the rugged individualist, right? This real, you know, self-made man, or the idea that anything happens in a singular fashion, which none of the supposed self-made men or self-made people did that on their own. Right. And to kind of go back to the original conversation that we were talking about, that Sarah brought up, and by the way, this is the best way to start my day with all you amazing big brains, is that when we were talking about the signs, right, and you felt like you were in that flow, I experienced that probably in the same way. I felt it was similar to what you were saying, because when it was happening, it was beyond the idea that there are signs that I'm getting and I'm taking them and it leads to the next. It was this feeling, I might get choked up. It was this feeling of like being held by the universe, right? That you were finally seen and understood, and you found your flow, and like it was reciprocal everywhere. Like you gave and you got back, and it just, there was no resistance anywhere. And it was like, oh, this is possible. This is so beautiful. But I think that it's easy for us to tell ourselves that it's so beautiful, that that's how it's supposed to be all the time. And I think it's, in effect, it's an ebb and flow like everything else. And we get held, and then there's a period of, where does that go? And I don't think that I mean, maybe there are some brilliant, amazing people out there. I can't ever say that I 100%, this is what this sign means. I think half the struggle is us sitting there and going, but what does it mean? You know, is it a sign saying we're going the wrong way, right? When I'm getting all these blocks, or is it a sign that says, well, if you're able to, you know, face these blocks and get through them, we're building your strength to be able to handle what's on the other side. How would we ever have the exact answer without just kind of blindly feeling our way through? And that's why I think creating these kind of spaces where, you know, we can reflect in each other's eyes and you know, share that we also struggle in these ways. Like there's no book. Here's your book. Like, this is how you do it. There isn't one.
Yeah.
Right.
So
go
ahead.
It brings another question to my mind, which I've had to ask and look at perpetually. And that is, what am I looking at if this isn't about me? And that doesn't mean I have to make it about something else.
Yeah.
But it's the egoic structure that keeps saying, well, I must have missed something. I should be doing it. Well, how, if I had, I. And so I think I've developed a grace with not needing to find an answer when I ask these questions, because the questions open space. That's the design of the questions on these realms, I think, is to create some space where I might be available to something else that's also there, rather than seeking a familiar to grab onto. But what am I looking at if none of this is about me?
That's really beautiful, because I do feel like there's a lot of individuality about all of our self-growth, right? But it reminds me of, I did actually send an email to inquire more, Carrie, about you're doing a interspecies communication thing, which I thought is amazing that there's even such an event organized. Again, that's not mine, we gotta pay attention. No, that's a beautiful. I was like just so happy to see that, and because I always try to have a balance between figuring things out and understanding that our big brains are a gift from Creator, and conversation, connection with other humans is some of the most beautiful, sacred moments in time. However, we are not, everything, of course, as humans. And so when I intentionally came outside and I was sitting on the ground for this call, because I'm a really good student. I'm kind of like a teacher's pet. I was all the time. So in these settings, I'm always like, oh, I think I know the right answer to that. And I'm trying to like stop that pattern. So hence I was sitting intentionally trying to sit on the ground. And I know Carrie has this beautiful, we refers sometimes to this beautiful relationship she has with the water and the ocean. And far be it for our brains to figure that out. But like you said, what's happening might involve us in a way that is small and precious and perfect, but small, but just different. And we all know this. But for whatever reason, it reminded me that you're taking part in that conference, Carrie, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, beautiful reminder, beautiful, just gladness that so many people are seeing it, are thinking about it, that there is a conference to have had.
Yeah.
I've been rereading Braiding Sweetgrass, and I love that book. It's a really beautiful book, and it got me thinking about language again, which is always a real source of fascination, in the way that English language obviously is reductive in some ways to other languages because of the lack of direct translation and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that she mentioned in there was our tendency to refer to the pronouns of things in nature as like it rather than she or he, and if we were to attach like more personalized pronouns to the natural world, would that change our perception of and our relationship with how we interacted with it, which got me thinking a lot. And the other thing that came up, which is where I was heading with this, was when she was relearning her native tongue, and the words that they attach to, like the bay and the tree, were verbs, not nouns. And she was really rejecting of this in the instance, like, that's ridiculous, it's a bay, it's a tree. And then she realized it was being a bay, and it was being a tree, like it was baying and it was treeing, because it was in flow and it was choosing in this moment to nestle its waters in between the walls. And I thought, well, what if I'm not Jane? What if I'm being a Jane in this moment? Like, what if I'm being a human? And what if you're being a Sarah? And you're not Sarah, you're not fixed, you're a verb, you're in a state of flow. And it seems so tiny, but the transition between viewing things from that perspective changes the dynamic for me. And I think, okay, in this moment, I'm being a Jane, and being a Jane right now can be really hard, is really hard in this moment. But because I'm being a Jane, tomorrow might be different. And what I have to continue to allow myself to be is new in each moment. So right now, being a Jane can be excruciating, but I won't presume that being Jane is going to be the same in 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 months. And I will just keep being present to what's going on within the understanding that different possibilities are always available. So I've been playing with that a little bit, and that softened the edges of things for me.
And it makes it creates smiling. It creates a space to look at it that way, you know? Yeah. One of the things I've been playing with is how humanity seems to be the only species interested in abstract definitions of life, and deciding that this is a thing, and now I know what that thing is, and I know what it does, and I know where it sits on what shelf in what box, and therefore next time I reference that thing, I can pull it off the shelf and say, see, I know the thing. But the rest of life happens in relationship to itself, because it is beingness, right? So how flexible can we be as humans, not to deny that, abstract definitions facilitate an economically driven society, bunch of fancy words, but not to deny that, but to also explore how life happens in relationship. What is relationship? What is it to relate? And I think Braiding Sweetgrass points at that constantly. And the non-human world lives in that constantly. Humans are the ones that define what a problem is and what intelligence is to solve that problem, while nature is simply happening and doesn't decide, well, that volcano is a real problem. The volcano erupts, right? And new life forms, and everybody adjusts, right? Like, one lemming isn't saying, screw you guys. I'm not jumping off the cliff. Lemmings are being lemmings. They lemming, and it's just, I have been having a lot of fun. And this is actually like at the crux of that, the presentation for that symposium that you mentioned, Jess, is looking at helping humanity see the way we've developed to function in these disconnected societies. And rather than vilify or say I shouldn't be, like, okay, how can I recognize, all right, that's what's happening, and where is that part of me that can show up and say, I've got you, even if I don't have a community, right? It's probably not looking to define who I am. It's probably just saying, oh, this is how you're carrying right now, this is how you're janing right now, so I've got you, I see it, I've got you. And that to me is, my heart is always open to that feeling and that space from within myself. Oh, I got you. Oh, that is what's happening. And it really asks me for an absence of judgment, which, takes some experience to human without judgment.
I've got a little passage on my desktop which sprang into my mind when you started talking about that. Can I read it? It's only a few sentences.
Please, yeah, please.
And I have done the most blasphemous thing, which is I'm not quite sure where I got this from. So I need to retrospectively find out so I can attribute it. But It says, culture replaces authentic feeling with words. As an example of this, imagine an infant lying in its cradle and the window is open, and into the room comes something marvelous, mysterious, glittering, shedding, light of many colors, movement, sound, a transformative hierophany of integrated perception. And the child is enthralled, and then the mother comes into the room and she says to the child, "That's a bird, baby, that's a bird." And instantly the complex wave of the angel, peacock, iridescent, transformative mystery is collapsed into a word. All mystery is gone. The child learns, this is a bird, this is a bird. And by the time we're 5 or 6 years old, the mystery of reality has been carefully tiled over with words. This is a bird, this is a house, this is the sky, and we seal ourselves in within a linguistic shell of disempowered perception. And I just thought that was so beautiful when I first read it, how we can miss the magic of things we see every day until you find yourself looking and going, wow, that bird is so beautiful. Like, I hadn't really looked at it before properly, but it's I think about that a lot as well, just how we can reduce things easily.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a stunning quote. Yeah, I love that, Jane.
That was one of the things I loved about Eckhart Tolle, was that he, one of the practices he talks about is go out into the world and take words off of things. Like, go look at a tree, but it's not a tree. Imagine that you just landed on this planet. You have never experienced a tree before, and just have that experience of taking it all in with no like box for it to be kept in, right? So it can go everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about signs, like there's like 5 of us sitting here talking about exactly what signs might look like. I mean, that seems like a pretty big sign.
That's true.
That you asked for.
That's true. I did want to say one more thing, and I think that's the only thing I wanted to go back to was just the idea that I agree with Sarah when she said that, we call it, sometimes it can be called spiritual bypassing. There's this idea of like, oh, well, there's a message here that you just need to get if you're struggling, right? But that is only one dimension of something that is really multiple dimensions. And you cannot get to that point if you don't allow your humanness and your emotion to be able to be seen and held. You can ultimately go, I know that I'm on a path and that there's going to be hardships and there's going to be good. I can know that, but right now I'm struggling and I need to connect with people that can sit with me and allow me to be struggling without needing to fix me or to tell me that it's all going to work out in the end, or, but can we hold that in the background while we allow ourselves to be human in this moment, and it be okay to do that?
Yeah.
And it's fine.
and that's what I feel so grateful for. Like there's this community that I've cultivated where we don't seek to fix each other. We just sit in the muck with one another. And it's like and it's so not spiritual bypassy. It's like, hey, there's going to be the goodness. This is a good vibes only club. This is like, hey, there's a reality sometimes to life that's really ugly and not very, very fancy. And it's not always going to be aligned, and it's not always going to be smooth. And sometimes it is. And I don't ever have the expectation that this is supposed to be some easy ride, but it's an interesting sort of like, okay, but it's been really excessively hard here. Like, this is a little bit too much in this direction. And so like, what is that about? But that's like, I think that's what I feel like, just this hopefulness by this conversation is hopefully this models for others this idea of, hey, we can come together and sit with each other and it's okay. And it isn't about this performative capitalistic, you have to be somewhere in the world and you have to achieve something. Like, no, we can just be human beings verbing, as Jane was saying,
verbing together,
right? We're just verbing together.
Christining and
Janing and carrying and Jessica.
And as well, when I look at you Sarahing over there in the situation, like, my thought isn't like, oh, Sarahing, that's like, yeah, no, that's not going well. Like, I'm just like, oh yeah, Sarahing, like, that's a thing. Like, that's, we don't look at it with judgment. And from the outside, it's like, there's nothing wrong with you. You've got, there's nothing to fix. There's nothing. It's just like, oh, that's hard. Like it's hard sometimes.
It's been hard. And I also like, there's this idea that like, there's a lot about my story that I haven't shared in this podcast. And there's been some beautiful moments of things that have shifted and different signs that have shown up. And that's why I was grateful for that first part of our conversation, because this helped me sort of reframe it. It's not that there haven't been, but that they're manifesting differently. And I think of that like spiral dynamics thing. It's like, we're growing and expanding and ever evolving, and we keep maybe hitting into the same thing over and over again. But as we kind of grow, our capacity has grown, and then we might hit into the same thingy again, because that's Sarahing. And when I'm Sarahing in my world, I keep hitting into these same things because that's my life story and my life path, and that's my spiritual contract for this lifetime. Yay. But I'm coming at it with a new nuance or a new layer or a new ease or a new spaciousness. And yeah, it might be frustrating. And why is this freaking thing happening again? But what the hell? But it's like, oh, but hang on. And there's this little thing that's different. And this little thing is different. And the sign is not this one anymore. And it's not that I'm looking or expecting for them. It's just I'm noticing, it's been a while since I've seen any. Right? Like, it's like,
dude,
you know what I mean? Like, dude, where'd they go? Like, it's not like I'm actively looking for them, because I'm just like, I know not to do that, because then I'm like doing confirmation bias stuff, and I'm too sciencey to want to do that to myself. Right. But it's more the noticing of, it's been a while since I've noticed those. Like, that's weird. Where did they go? More from that perspective, not that I'm actively seeking, but in the fact that the familiarity, those ones aren't showing up. It's like, oh, but then it was like a whisper. It showed up like words, like a whisper, like a download. And that was different. That was a new sign that started showing up in the last few years. So it wasn't this version. It was a manifesting as a whisper of something different wanting to emerge, and I can feel it in myself. And then somebody else mentions that exact thing, and I go, oh, there it is. But it didn't show up the way I was used to seeing it. So it's almost like orienting to the new at this new level of the spiral, so to speak. And getting used to hearing that new voice or that new message style.
And trusting yourself within that, I think.
Yeah. And going, oh, okay, that's cool. So that was, okay, I can start to attend to that now and go, it's not always going to look like this,
That is so beautiful to me. Like, the words in my mind for what you're sharing is to orient toward the unfamiliar. And there's so much conditioning to fear or avoid unfamiliar, when really unfamiliar is where it's at. It's where growth happens. We have honestly just about 2 minutes left, and I know we could continue for days. It always gets juicy right at the end of the conversation, but I want to leave a little space if anybody would like to say anything in wrap up, or any way that you'd like to finish our conversation today. Anything in conclusion anyone would like to say?
Somebody said something earlier about isolation and how we live in a world where there's a lot of that. Some people more than others, and some people there's layers of it. And I think this compass conversation, I'm just reminded at the fact that we're not so isolated, and we're not so different, and other people are feeling and carrying these things too, and noticing these things too. And if you're feeling alone in that, there are people out there who are noticing these things too, and who grapple with these things, and who sit in the nuances and the meta layers of this stuff. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for what feels like the opposite of isolation right now. The collective sense of we-ness.
We're all weeing together.
We're all weeing.
Yeah, we're weeing. Oh my gosh.
You're weeing. I was hoping for a Jane. I love when Jane is Janing. And so I was kind of hoping Jane would Jane there. That was so perfectly timed.
We're weeing together. Yeah.
We're weeing together. Yes, I love that. Yeah. So thank you for weeing with me.
Anytime.
I think we see that there's no one right way to wee, right? There's many ways to wee.
I'm just looking forward to when people in the UK and Australia hear this, because weeing actually has a meaning for something.
Right.
But go ahead, Jess, you were going to say something.
No, I think I'm vaguely aware of that. So I'm just going to take
That's
it.
what I'm laughing about right now is the double meaning of
gonna
weeing right now. That's what I'm kind of picking up on
Double
and finding
entendre.
hilarious. Oh yeah.
I'm going to get every opportunity that I can.
And on that note, thank you guys so much for being here and sharing your brilliance, and you're amazing. What an honor to be among you. Thank you all so much.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
This is fun. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you, everyone.